Wow, what a great way to end our day. I'd like to invite both of the speakers back up so that we can ask them questions. I have a couple while we're getting set up here. So I think my first question is to Laura, Dr. Burgelt. When I reviewed your slides, I was actually astonished to see the wide variation in the prenatal supplements. And even further, I was more surprised to see that there was such a variation between prescription and non-prescription formularies. I was wondering if you have any knowledge or access to information about which patient populations are accessing these various formulations. And I guess just in my own anecdotal evidence, patients who are publicly insured are getting the prescription ones, and that's because they're paid for. Mm-hmm. They don't have to pay for those, whereas patients who have private health insurance usually come into the pregnancy on a whole milieu of things that they jump on my desk and ask me if it's safe. Now I'm going to be much better informed about that. So just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. You're exactly spot on. So what we find is for public insurance is typically prescription multivitamins because of the cost and the copay or no pay. And with private insurance, it's really shoppers, either over the counter, online. It's all over the place. And I think I would love to dive deeper into the data that you're collecting about the supplement and why people are using it and how they're making a choice. Because I think that's a question that I've often asked my patients, when they're in a clinic, how did you choose this one? And you've shown that, almost half said it was because someone told them, so they may have told them to use it. I'm wondering if they're the ones that also told what product to buy, because that's not been my experience. But I think that's where I have actually the most concern, because I think there's a lot of products available. When we did our Amazon searches, and it was astonishing to me what you could find. And so, it shouldn't have been. But I think it speaks to all the different factors that a patient may be looking to make that decision. It's much more open in that private insurance piece or no insurance piece than the public insurance. Yeah,
it's very fascinating to me that we take this vulnerable population and give them exposures to so many non-standardized therapies. So I think that was really interesting. We'll start.
Can I just, just to that point, with 2 of my 3 pregnancies, the clinician asked me not to even come in for a visit until 8 weeks to make sure that the pregnancy was viable. So we've missed a lot of opportunities for a lot of patients to prevent neural tube defects if we're not seeing patients until at least 8 weeks. So small study, but well conducted.
I can say that in some practices, I can tell you that although that appointment isn't made, the recommendation and the prescription for the prenatal vitamin goes in immediately.
And I think it speaks a lot to preconception counseling. I think when we talk about reproductive age and knowing that unplanned pregnancy rate is almost 50% in our country, that's a conversation we can continually have.
My question was about the prenatals that are by prescription versus not, along the lines that you just had. And I was thinking, what constitutes a prenatal vitamin being available via prescription only? I mean, I saw in your talk earlier, Reagan, that they contained increased amounts of certain ingredients, but not for all of the vitamin and minerals. So is it because they're registered, they've got these stamps of approval, so they're higher costs? I mean, what is it that makes them prescription versus not?
Go ahead.
You're welcome to do it. The way that dietary supplements are regulated in this country through the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act doesn't really cover prescription prenatals. It's more over the counter. And some of the work that Leila Saldana and others at ODS have done are exactly to your point, that there are much higher doses for folic acid and iron in prescription products. Prescription products are also more likely to have stool softeners, whereas over-the-counter do never have stool softeners in. But I don't know what specifically differentiates when something can be a prescription versus not a prescription.
My understanding is the manufacturing and testing processes, and how that then goes through and presumably an FDA process compared to a supplement process.
And I think there's another layer with insurance companies on top of that. So beyond that process, there's the who are you contracted with process.
I never like to talk about it because
I know.
I feel like I don't want to shine a light anywhere that's going to take these away from people.
I wanted to thank both of you for your talk, but particularly Dr. Burgett on the whole issue of dissolution and disintegration, which is something I think many of us are very much interested in. And two questions. The first is with the 5-methyltetrahydrofolate salts. Do you know, are they acceptable in terms of their dissolution and disintegration? And how stable are they?
The data that I have seen show that they are acceptable for the dissolution. In terms of stability, I'm not sure.
Okay.
It's a metabolically active form, so most of the time when something is metabolically active, it's pretty quickly taken up into the system, so that would be my pharmacologic educated guess, but yeah.
The other question is just the different ways you formulate things in tablets or whatever. And we know about bedpan bullets and other supplements, but for prenatals, are there problems with some of the compacting sort of ways that you make the tablets or other forms?
You know, it's interesting when we actually did our study looking at the labels and then the content. It was actually an honors project with a student. It was a great honors project. She'd had some lab experience, and we actually had several conversations about the ease for which something would disintegrate or not. And what we found is that it completely varied in whether something was chewable or not chewable, or something was in a capsule or not a capsule. That speaks to the excipients and the glue, so to speak. And predominantly tablets rule the market for that reason. They tend to be the most compliant when it comes to ease. But I think I'll just say, speaking from Colorado and seeing, I'll just say it, the CBD and cannabis market moving into every formulation possible is making me wonder if other types of supplements will get a similar idea. I'm not suggesting inhaling your prenatal vitamin. I'm just, it's been shocking to me how many different ways you can get these supplements into products. And it's been a really high money making business. And so I fear for some of our, I'll consider more typical supplements, that type of range will occur, which will make it even more difficult.
First, I'm here to ask Reagan to turn on her mic.
No one's ever done that before.
So I've got a couple of my own questions, and then we've got questions from the webinar, but I'll let Angela go before I ask the questions from the webinar. One is the way in which N. Haynes asks the questions about whether or not you're taking a supplement. So that question can either be, did you take a supplement in the last 24 hours, or did you take a supplement within the past 30 days? And my real issue here is the fact that we're not addressing, while you say 77% of women are taking a prenatal supplement, that does not mean that they're taking it every single day during pregnancy, because we know compliance with supplements is really low.
Yeah, so N. Haynes now collects it both ways. So in the home interview, they ask to see containers and ask how frequently over the last 30 days have you taken this product. And then as part of both of the 24-hour recalls, they said, in the home, you said you took this product. Did you take it on this particular day?
Right.
So we've done a lot of work looking at the difference between the questionnaire and the 24-hour recall in adults who are not pregnant. What we see is that there tends to be a digit preference from the home interview. So people say they take it 30 or 25 or 10 or 5 days. Most people who say they take it 30 out of 30 days report it on the 24-hour recall. So it was around 80% of people who say they take it every day who was captured on the recall. But there's always omissions, there's insertions, so people might start taking a new product before the 24-hour recall. And it's really tough to know about how that would hold up in different surveys, because they saw the container in the home and then they prompted them, did you take that? That might have some response bias associated with it. There's never been a published study that really compares supplement reporting.
Well, actually, there is. So part of the iron supplementation study we did with CDC, we used MIMS tops on the prenatal supplements that records the date and timing. And
I meant like with recovery biomarkers or PABA or something like that. Sorry, I should have been specific.
Right. But the MIMS tops actually showed for pregnant women the fact that they were over-reporting supplement use substantially compared to the number of times that those bottles were being opened on a daily basis. So I just want to point that out because while you look at it and say a lot of women are taking these supplements, in fact, we have really no idea about how frequently they are taking it. The second question is. Laura, you were basically showing differences in labeling between some of the prenatal supplements and the multivitamin supplements in terms of the percent of daily requirements that are being met. And so my question is, what's the reference group that's being used for the prenatal vitamin versus the multivitamin?
Well, these are the ones that I was showing you were all prenatal multivitamins.
Right, but what's the reference group in terms of who is the daily value?
Well, I think that's one of my points because, and I think it's a very good question because I think, is it pregnancy? Is it lactation? Is it, adult? And I think that's where we're getting some of the differences. And when I'm saying, I guess my suggestion is let's have a standardization. I'm not sure that we have to say it's above or below or it has to be this or that. It's just that if I know that if I'm getting 400 IUs of vitamin D, that's going to be the same percent on my daily value that I need because we're using the same reference point. And that's my ask.
So there are 4 categories in that FDA uses. It's 1 to 3, 4 to 8, pregnancy, and then adulthood. Or I might have those mixed up. But for pregnancy, it uses a population coverage approach for the RDA for pregnant women. So that's the reference there. But there are the 4 groups that FDA uses as the reference.
Right, but I don't know that every manufacturer who's putting labels on the bottles is using that same reference point, and that's the problem.
And
so
the fact
Kathy
that
is raising her hand.
multivitamins.
She's FDA.
Yes, tell us.
Former FDA. She would know
Kathleen
more.
Kohler. I'm not FDA, although I have worked at HHS and FDA in the past. And I wanted to just kind of address a piece of this issue, not the reference group, which I would assume that they are using the pregnancy reference group as Regan suggested, but the labeling, the food labeling, nutrition facts, reference values have changed with the new nutrition label. At the same time, the supplement daily values have changed to become consistent with the nutrition facts reference values. So I think that's a source of a lot of issues around units for different nutrients on the label because they, in my impression is, and I didn't work on this, but I was around for some of the discussions, the goal was to make it as up-to-date as possible, to make it consistent with the latest RDI values. So you had perhaps new numerical values, but also some new units.
Right.
And the biggest issue with the units, in my impression at the time, and it looks like it's been playing out in practice, is the dietary folate equivalents. And so the RDIs are in terms of dietary folate equivalents, which when you're looking at a food and you're combining perhaps some fortification folate and naturally occurring folate, well, then you wash it all out into a dietary folate equivalent. But the RDI is in terms of dietary folate equivalent, but the special recommendation for pregnancy is 400 micrograms of preformed folic acid. So that recommendation didn't start out as a dietary folate equivalent. So when we then put that onto a supplement label, we're sort of gone into the rabbit hole or gone into Alice in Wonderland.
Right.
So I've been concerned about this, but I haven't followed this issue. But I guess I would recommend this to any follow-up work that's done on recommendations for pregnancy and lactation, is take a look at this labeling issue, and particularly for the folate, but there may be others where it also rears its head because of special recommendations for pregnancy and lactation, and some of these units have become very confusing. So I really appreciate that you raised that issue.
Thank you. And for me, I would say folic acid and iron are the two that I would echo your comments for right now, but calcium has had that shadow in the past as well at times, and so there are a number of those. Vitamin D even, a question came up about D2 or D3. So there are ways that I'm not saying every product should have the exact same thing in it, but that we can just communicate it better. So thank you for your comments, I appreciate that.
So Anna Maria asked the first part of the question that I had for Dr. Bailey, which is about underreporting or accuracy in reporting. So the second part of that question, I know in dietary data, we commonly have differences in reporting across race and ethnicity, across when we look at women that may be obese as compared to those that are lean. Do you know if there is any differences in reporting when it comes to dietary supplements? And then the second part of that question also another second question was for Dr. Bailey related to participation in food assistance like WIC. And I know one of the things that you mentioned is that when people most have been recommended the supplement, when they take supplements, it was based on the recommendation of a provider. I'm assuming that the question is around healthcare provider, or is there any discussion of WIC or other types of participation in public assistance programs?
Yeah, so the question is any healthcare provider. So it can be any type of clinician or any type of encounter that women have. We are able to look at WIC participation, SNAP participation in NHANES, but we haven't done that specific to pregnancy or lactation.
Thanks.
So, Dr. Bailey, I have a question, kind of a big question. How do you think we can optimize data collection on nutrient intake? And do you think we can reliably evaluate that in the context of both maternal health and birth outcomes?
Wow. It's like Miss America question. Well, if I was Miss America, I think that technology is really helping the way that we collect data. Specifically in the supplement space, being able to take pictures rather than having the extensive home visits, which is time intensive. I met someone at lunch today who was an actual NHANES participant, and it does take a considerable amount of time to collect that high quality level of data. So NCHS is looking at ways to streamline the survey. So I think that there's a lot of work going on to improve our methods. Despite the things that we talked about with energy underreporting and misreporting of supplements, when we have compared usual folate intakes to both serum and red blood cell folates and plot them at the distribution level, they are nearly superimposable, except at the 5th and the 95th percentiles where there's some deviation. So we don't have good recovery biomarkers for all nutrients. We have concentration biomarkers, and so utilizing that type of approach specific to pregnancy where we have issues with hemodilution, and so we don't know how reflective concentration biomarkers are for nutrients. So that was a long way around of saying I don't know the best way, but I think that's an active area of investigation.
So we have another question from our webinar audience, and that is, let's have this conversation about the MTHFR that you started. And can you explore this a little bit more as to whether or not that is something we should be considering?
Well, I think the thing that I would add was, you just reminded me, is that, when we look at the studies and look at the biomarkers, doesn't seem to matter that much. Folic acid, folate, the 5-LT, the metabolically active form, as long as women are having a sufficient healthy diet, we get what we need. And so is the question, I think, then becomes, do we actively look at the biomarkers to establish that? I think because it doesn't matter, it's not clinically meaningful, even though it may be statistically, or, we can argue it here in this type of a room. I'm thinking about, the thousands of patients I've seen over the years, and, me struggling with how do you make the best recommendation. And I think at the end of the day, if they're eating a good diet and they're supplementing with the folic acid that we have, I think most of them are in pretty good shape. But I'd be happy to entertain the conversation. I invite you to sit right next to me.
Come on up, Yvonne.
You want to add to that?
She's truly the expert, so I would default to Yvonne at any time.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk again about folate. And the MTHFR genotype has been a big question in the public, and so it's good to bring this up again. So just perhaps as an introductory information, so the MTHFR genetic variant is a common polymorphism in the population. There's about 10 to 12% in our US and Canadian population that have the homozygous genotype, and about 40% the heterozygous genotype. That's when you put them combined. So one has to having the mutation is about 40 to 60%. In the days where the MTHFR genotype was associated with a higher risk of neurotube defect risk, this comes from countries like in Europe, where there was no folic acid fortification, where there was an average a much lower folate status, and therefore women who had the TT genotype, so the homozygous genotype, had a higher risk for neurotube defect affected pregnancies. Also in the European countries, including in my PhD decades ago, we showed that women who have the TT genotype have significantly lower red blood cell folate concentration compared to the women who have the CT or CC genotype. Now coming back to today in US and Canada, where we have a folate replete population, as has been mentioned also earlier, because of the folic acid food fortification, the very high prevalence of supplement use, we're at an adequate folate status that we don't see differences anymore between those genotypes. So one of the questions was whether the women are unable, or whether the genetic variant leads us to not convert folic acid sufficiently. That is not correct. As we have shown in supplementation trials, women with TT, men and women with TT, they also metabolize folic acid. That is not the case. And so now in this case, the genotype there's no longer a gene-nutrient interaction with respect to the neurotube defect. So it's not a concern. And then coming back to the 5-MTHF, do they benefit more from this? Well, if we start off with a low baseline red blood cell or folate status, then 5-MTHF was shown to increase folate status more rapidly, but they come later on to the same folate levels. So there it's more bioavailable. But again, in both groups, women can reach the 906, the threshold for the lowest NTD risk. So in the long run, and especially in this folate replete population, I'd not be concerned about the MTHFR genetic variant, or that somebody would need to take folic acid or 5-MTHF based on their genetic profile.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Cindy Turner-Maffei with the Healthy Children Project. My brain feels like it's going to blow up. But I just had one question about a vitamin preparation I'm not that familiar with. I recently visited the UK and saw a lot of spray vitamin D for buccal use. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if it wasn't specifically for pregnancy, but I wonder if you have any information about those preparations.
Well, this is exactly what I was getting to earlier. And sublingual administration with some, and this is getting maybe a little bit outside the scope of just prenatal, but sublingual administration for some vitamins and minerals may be okay and not for others. I don't have data, in the back pocket here on vitamin D specifically. It makes sense to me that they would try to be using that, but a lot of it has to do with what the excipient is in the spray to make sure that vitamin D is actually transferring or being emitted from that in a bioavailable form. And so when we look at lipophilic compounds or fatty compounds like a vitamin D, that becomes an important aspect. I don't know the product you're considering, but this is exactly what I'm kind of getting at when we look at the explosion of different products that have become available, and how do we really maintain the quality and purity of that. So I'm sorry I don't have a direct answer for you, except for I can understand why that was done. I hope that they were using the right excipient for it to be bioavailable. But the other thing I will say is that we even noticed this through asthma research and inhalers in terms of what a person may actually get through a spray versus a tablet, widely different, just from the topography of how they might use that spray. So I'll leave it at that for now, but that's exactly what I was talking about earlier.
Carolyn Hightower, Vitamix Foundation. Dr. Bailey, you opened your comments of you usually talk about food and supplement. I just wanted to give you the opportunity. What would you say about food?
Well, Americans are not following the dietary guidelines, and pregnancy is not very different from non-pregnant populations in that intakes of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains remain very low relative to recommendations. Sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars remain high. And so I think that there are a lot of dietary improvements that could be made across the whole U.S. population. Pregnant women tend to do slightly better, but still fall below the recommendations. So we always recommend foods first. But there are some nutrients that it's very difficult to meet your requirements through foods alone. We now have a lot of foods that are fortified with vitamin D, special population groups. We touched on vegans and vegetarians. Anyone who is eliminating entire food groups might need special consideration for supplemental nutrients.
Okay, I think that's it for the day. At this point in time, I'm going to invite Anna Marie to come back up and give us some reflections on the day.